as an accommodation to the senator from Indiana who wants to make a special introduction, Senator Cruz and I will turn to him first.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Cruz, I thank you for the privilege of doing this. As you know, I tried hard to get on this subcommittee and didn't make it on the basis of seniority, but I commend both you and Senator Cruz for your leadership on this. It's real pleasure for me to introduce a distinguished constituent from Purdue University, Stephen Collicott. Dr. Stephen Collicott is an expert in his field and has received his undergraduate degrees from the University of Michigan and master's from Stanford, but joined the Purdue faculty in West Lafayette, Indiana in 1991, where he is a professor in the School of Aeronautics and Astronautics. As you know, Mr. Chairman, our Aero-Astro program at Purdue is fairly well known. 22 astronauts have come out of Purdue and flown. Maybe one of them with you on your flight. I'm not so sure.
Do you know the institution that has produced more than any other university?
I'd love to say it was Purdue, but I think you're going to probably name some university in Florida.
No, it's actually the Naval Academy.
Oh, really? Okay. That makes sense. The ultimate in flying assignments. But such notables as Gus Grissom and Neil Armstrong and many, many others have come out of the Purdue program. Dr. Collicott has led a team of students in providing a experimental project that will be operated on the International Space Station and a number of other distinguished accomplishments. And so I want to just welcome him here today. I regret that I don't serve on this subcommittee. I would love to stay, but other subcommittees have made other callings, so I have to excuse myself on that. But I thank you for the opportunity to introduce Dr. Collicott.
Thank you so much. Senator Cruz?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses who are here today. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity for us to have this hearing and to get to know more about the exciting potential for advancing our space-related knowledge and achievement by taking advantage of the competitive forces and creative drive of the private sector. Our economy has a great stake in the space race. Last year, 78 orbital launches were conducted worldwide, 20 of which were commercial launches. And those 20 launches generated more than $2.4 billion in revenues, of which an estimated $108 million was attributed to U.S. launches. Activity in the space industry creates good, high-tech jobs now, and it inspires our next generation of leaders as well. For years, the U.S. government has worked as a partner with the commercial space industry, and the NASA Authorization Act of 2010 set in place a productive balance between the two that continues to bear fruit. Today, I look forward to hearing from our panel about how we can achieve even greater efficiencies from that balance and how we can encourage more significant investment from the commercial space industry and what legal and regulatory challenges are presented by its future development. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. As you can see, we run things a little differently on this committee. We're a little more informal. But when it gets to the subject of commercial space, it becomes extremely important. It becomes extremely important that we get American vehicles flying Americans back up to the space station. It's extremely important that we have vehicles that are designed the safest possible, which the new generation of rockets are being designed that way. It was certainly an admonition of the Gaiman Commission that investigated the last space shuttle disaster that said that once you've completed the space station with the space shuttle, you shut it down and you replace it with a safer rocket. And of course, that is being designed right now. We see the new applications of commercial activity in space. And although we've always had, basically, it's been the contractors that have produced the hardware and the systems under NASA's direction that has given us this extraordinarily successful program. It now enters a new dimension of commercial space. I just came from a meeting with the President's nominee for the Department of Transportation, and we discussed the same. And it's very important that the Office of Commercial Space Transportation in the Department of Transportation understand that they should never get into these stovepipes that are so typical in government, where turf becomes more important than the mission. And then the turf battles and all the little jealousies occur. And that the Department of Transportation, I shared with the nominee, should do what their mission is, which is to handle and administratively and let NASA do what NASA does best, and not try to compete with each other. Now, we're going to be doing a NASA authorization bill this year, and it's going to be an updating of the Commercial Space Launch Act. And so we're going to be using these hearings to help us develop the policy that will continue to guide our space community toward the goal of exploring the heavens. And so there's a lot to discuss, suborbital space, and I'm going to insert in the record my comments. Let me introduce our panel members. Wayne Hale comes to us as Director of the Human Spaceflight for Special Aerospace Services. He's retired NASA. He's held positions including NASA Flight Director and Space Shuttle Program Manager. Mr. Hale is going to discuss how commercial space efforts contribute toward national space exploration goals and the government's role in supporting the private space sector growth. Ms. Patti Grace Smith is an aerospace consultant and advisor. She has extensive experience in the U.S. space sector, both as a former associate administrator of FAA's Office of Commercial Space and as the current chair of the NASA Advisory Council's Commercial Space Committee. She will address the federal policies, needs, and recommendations affecting the private space industry and ways to maximize collaborations between FAA, NASA, and private space ventures. Captain Michael Lopez-Alegria is president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. A NASA astronaut, a veteran of 4 space flights, commander of ISS Expedition 14. Now he works to promote commercial spaceflight. And he'll provide an overview of the progress and plans of the commercial spaceflight industry, as well as policy recommendations. And Dr. Collicott, we have already had introduced by the senator from Indiana. So thank you for being here and bringing your expertise to the discussion. So with that, Mr. Hale, we're going to put your written testimony in the record. If you'll summarize it within about 5 minutes, and we'll just go down the line. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Chairman Senator Nelson, and thank you, Ranking Member Senator Cruz, and the entire committee for inviting me to testify on this important matter. In the interest of full disclosure, you should note that I spent most of my professional life working at NASA in the Space Shuttle program. As a matter of fact, Senator Nelson, I was in mission control during your flight just a few years ago. During those many years, I have seen NASA at its very best and at its worst. The hard-working dedication of NASA personnel is phenomenal, and their talent and creativity are second to none. However, their endeavors have frequently been stymied due to the inherent bureaucratic inefficiencies of government work and the frequent shifts in priorities and funding that whipsaw space initiatives. My last NASA assignment was to define the management philosophy for the new Commercial Crew program. After leaving NASA, my work has continued as a consultant. My company, Special Aerospace Services, advises entities involved in the Commercial Crew and commercial space cargo enterprises. And I have volunteered my time to work with the Commercial Spaceflight Federation to establish industry standards for this fledgling community. So the committee can see that I am hardly a disinterested party. In space today, the most singularly vexing problem is the high cost of getting to low Earth orbit. As Robert Heinlein once observed, when you are in Earth orbit, you are halfway to anywhere in the universe, which accurately reflects the physics of the situation. Today, getting that first step to the universe is very costly. Hundreds of potential business opportunities in the limitless resources of the solar system have floundered on the high cost of transportation to low Earth orbit. Asteroid mining, energy production, zero-gravity manufacturing are all within our grasp technologically, but will not be profitable businesses, until reliable and reasonably affordable transportation systems are in place. However, these new transportation systems to low Earth orbit have very high development cost. So we are in a chicken or the egg paradox. Space business needs low-cost transportation to become profitable, while potential private transportation services need established businesses to justify the cost of their construction. This is not the first time America has been in this situation. Both the early railroads and the fledgling air transportation industries found themselves becalmed in similar straits. The federal taxpayer stepped in to provide critical resources to help those industries develop. These federal investments paid back myriad-fold in tax revenues when the new industries caught fire. The history of space flight has been marked with the goal of decreasing the cost of transportation to low Earth orbit. In the last decade, the United States has embarked on a bold new experiment to turn over the creative reins of spacecraft development to nimble, flexible, creative, private commercial firms. Bolstered with a modicum of taxpayer resources, these businesses have leveraged private investment to develop new, much cheaper transportation systems. We see the first fruits of success today with the cargo-carrying craft, SpaceX's Falcon and Dragon, and Orbital Sciences' Antares and Cygnus. These cargo-carrying privately developed vehicles are starting to supply our government outpost, the International Space Station. In future years, the Boeing CST-100 and Sierra Nevada Dream Chaser, both flying on the proven ULA Atlas V rocket, will be added to the fleet to carry human beings as well as cargo. Poised on the cusp of these new systems, America runs the risk of being penny-wise and pound-foolish as we make the same mistake that doomed the space shuttle to much higher-cost operations, starving spacecraft development programs in the name of saving a few pennies for today's budget bottom line, resulting in compromised systems that, if they fly at all, will not be cheap enough to enable business in space. Regarding NASA's deep space exploration plans, the commercial systems will enable deep space exploration initiative in substantial ways. First, the International Space Station is our test laboratory for the critical technologies and systems that deep space exploration will need. Commercial transportation of cargo and crews to the ISS directly support deep space systems development. As deep space exploration proceeds, commercial crew and cargo vehicles will likely be called on to aid with assembly and fuel delivery to low Earth orbit. Cost-effective commercial transportation to the low Earth orbit can make a vital difference in equipping the space fleet. The two efforts go hand in hand. Funding equity between the two programs is necessary to ensure the timely success of both. I urge Congress to fully fund both of these vital activities. They will allow American and American industries to lead in the exploration and development of human activity in our solar system. Paraphrasing John F. Kennedy, there is no project that is so important for the long-term success of humankind. And I hope that those historians of the future will record that at this crossroads of history, a creative, enterprising, far-sighted nation called America led that way. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hale. Ms. Smith?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cruz, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this hearing. As a former Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation and as a current participant in the commercial space industry, I appreciate very much the opportunity to comment on partnerships to advance the business of space. These are milestone times for commercial space transportation. They are times that call for a balanced approach to make sure we know how we got here, where we are, where we're going, and how to best integrate the strengths, accomplishments, and lessons of the pioneers of American spaceflight and the pioneers of new space. Long-standing promises of commercial spaceflight are turning into visible results. SpaceX is servicing the International Space Station. Boeing recently performed a successful test of an integrated test article. Orbital Sciences has orbited a payload. Virgin Galactic has test dropped its space passenger vehicle, all remarkable achievements that some did not expect. Sierra Nevada recently successfully completed its integrated system safety analysis review. And the list of new developers goes on and on. X-Corp, Maston, Blue Origin, and Armadillo Aerospace, each determined, each hopeful and relentless, each focused on safety, and all making steady progress. The Atlas rocket continues to deliver mission excellence and reliability with unparalleled success. For years, the commercial space industry contended with skepticism. Now it must deal with the effects of enthusiasm. Both can be equally daunting. There is a risk that new enthusiasts with the best of intentions will try to change industry aims just as commercial space reaches its target. I hope that will not happen. That is why this is a time for special discernment. When Congress approved the Commercial Space Act of 1984, one of the elements was the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, or AST, that in 1996 found a home at the FAA. That decision made it possible for early commercial space leadership to observe and absorb lessons that helped AST guide an industry from the nursery to emerging maturity. In the 1984 Act, Congress passed legislation that created a flexible, open venue that invited opportunity rather than proscribing innovation while permitting no compromise on safety. Over the years, entrepreneur and regulator have worked hard to keep finding better, safer ways to conduct spaceflight. Congress established what became a model for space efforts in countries worldwide. The coexistence of both air and space in the FAA has forced any and all issues of how things might work out on the table. My observation is that since before the relocation of space in the FAA, as it was formerly located in the Office of the Secretary, aviation never had to really consider it or any other new entity in its airspace. AST's presence has forced the conversation and a greater awareness of that thing we call the NAS, the National Airspace System, which is a national asset belonging to the nation, and we share it as we do all other things national. Therefore, for the near term, I strongly favor keeping the Office of Commercial Space Transportation within the FAA as more launch manifests develop. Once that happens and space launch and space activities become a regular occurrence, a regular user in the NAS, Congress should move with deliberate speed to move AST to the Department of Transportation to take its rightful, its logical place as another transportation mode, as all other modes of transportation. I firmly believe that this is what former Secretary Elizabeth Dole had in mind when she proposed to President Reagan that commercial space reside in the Department of Transportation during its infancy, and what former FAA Administrator David Henson had in mind when he announced to all of the FAA management team the day commercial space arrived at the FAA, and I quote, "It will be a line of business, different but equal to all other lines of business. We, the FAA, will enable this industry to develop to a level of robustness and routine to fulfill the dream of space as transportation. That is still the dream, and we are closer to fulfilling it than ever before." I believe AST should continue to supervise and solely regulate suborbital commercial launch operations, including those associated with rocket launches of either humans or cargo. The FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation licenses the launch system as a whole, but the FAA's Office of Aviation Safety certificates the carrier aircraft when it is flying alone, even when the aircraft is operating in support of launch-related activities. And my final point is that I strongly support extending indemnification as a recommendation at a minimum of 10 years. I'll be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Captain?
Chairman Nelson, Ranking Member Cruz, good morning again. I want to say it's an honor to be seated at this table with my colleagues, and thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts on partnerships to advance the business of space with you. About a year ago, after 20 years and over 4,000 orbits of the Earth, I decided to leave what was arguably a pretty good job as a NASA astronaut to come here. And I did that because this is really important. I truly believe that commercial spaceflight is important to the future of our human exploration of space in this country. We're about to restore an imperative national capability to democratize access to space and to build an industry that I'm convinced will lead the world. And frankly, I can't think of a more honorable calling than to be part of it. The Commercial Spaceflight Federation represents over 40 companies across the country that are working to make commercial spaceflight a reality. Their spheres of influence range from near space with science and technology payloads on high-tech and very high-altitude balloons to suborbit, low Earth orbit, and beyond. The era of commercial human spaceflight began with the fantastic achievements of the Spaceship One team that won the Ansari X Prize back in 2004 by sending a piloted, reusable vehicle to an altitude of over 100 kilometers twice in the span of 5 days. In recent weeks, there have been even more exciting accomplishments that point to the beginning of commercial suborbital operations within the next year. One was a testing by X-Corps of a piston pump-powered rocket motor. This technology represents a giant leap in the quest for a propulsion system whose reusability approaches that of a commercial jet. And another milestone that was mentioned before is a test flight by Scaled Composites of Spaceship Two, a larger version of its predecessor for Virgin Galactic. Its rocket motor, developed by the Sierra Nevada Corporation, was ignited for the first time in flight after being released from its mothership at almost 50,000 feet altitude. But as impressive as these vehicles are, there's a big difference between suborbital vehicles and orbital vehicles. In space, getting there is all about speed. And to get to 100 kilometers altitude, you need to go about Mach 3. To get to orbit, you need to go about Mach 25. And you can appreciate that there's a pretty big difference there. And that's the reason that until recently, orbit has been the domain of nation states and their agencies. However, in addition to ULA, United Launch Alliance's incredible record of successful launches recently, Space Exploration Technologies and Orbital Science Corporation, in the context of NASA's COTS program, have demonstrated the ability to achieve orbital spaceflight. And in fact, SpaceX has now twice delivered cargo to and returned it under NASA's CRS contract from the International Space Station. This space station represents not only an investment of tens of billions of dollars, but is also an unparalleled research facility where scientists and other researchers from around the world can conduct experiments in an environment that is not duplicatable anywhere on or off the planet. We strongly encourage the Congress to extend the utilization of ISS to its design life limit of 2028. I went to the ISS for the third time back in 2006, but unlike the first two times, I wasn't on the space shuttle. I, in fact, rode a Soviet-designed rocket and capsule called Soyuz. Since the retirement of the shuttle, it's been the only mode of transport available to U.S. astronauts. But building on the success of the commercial cargo programs, NASA is engaged in development of commercial crew system that has already created thousands of high-tech jobs across America. At the same time, using innovative Space Act agreement transaction authorities, it's achieved a progress far in excess of that likely to have been accomplished in a traditional development contract, yet while saving the taxpayer considerable money. But funding levels below those proposed by NASA have resulted in a delay in operational capability, and as we know, every year that we can't launch American astronauts to space on American rockets is another year of sending over $450 million to Russia. It's imperative that we execute this program vigorously, which implies, among other things, full funding or funding at the highest possible levels. History is littered with examples of empires that failed to adapt to changing times and were thus dethroned by others who did. Our world is very different from the heyday of NASA budgets that commanded 4.5% of federal spending. But by intelligently partnering with the private sector, our space agency and indeed our nation can continue to lead the world in mankind's greatest endeavor. I look forward to discussing with you some of the policy details that are addressed in my written testimony, and I hope that my comments today will help you materially contribute to your formulation and ultimate passage of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. Dr. Collicott.
Thank you, Chairman Nelson and Ranking Member Cruz and the committee. I'm pleased to be here and to address this committee. I'm going to speak on the role of private suborbital space industry on research and education. A little bit first, I'm a professor in the School of Aeronautics and Astronautics at Purdue University in the College of Engineering. Purdue is the home of 23 astronauts. In my position, I have been teaching and researching topics in fluid dynamics for 23 years. My research explores the basic fluid physics for improving things like pulmonary health, fuel efficiency and transportation, communication satellite lifetime, jet engine cooling and lubrication, and similar. It's a nice job. I'm active in spaceflight research. In this sense, I'm a member of the Suborbital Applications Researchers Group, working with Commercial Spaceflight Federation. We're a group of volunteer researchers to promote research uses in this new industry. I serve on the Scientific Advisory Board of CASIS, the Center for the Advancement of Science in Space. I am principal investigator of the Fluids Education Experiment, scheduled to be launched to Space Station in 2014. I'm building payloads to fly with suborbital companies, Armadillo, Blue Origin, Maston, X-Corps, and Virgin Galactic, plus the high-altitude balloon company Nearspace. I've worked through experiment design, payload integration, and launch operations even with some of these companies, and I've seen firsthand how this privately financed, uniquely American industry is poised to deliver remarkable new scientific research capabilities. Researchers need to begin now to have experiments ready to exploit these new capabilities for science that can impact our lives here on Earth. Already my student-built payloads have flown with an expensive German payload on Armadillo test flights. Now, 3 minutes of high-quality microgravity test time is ideal for a number of physical sciences, and others wish to look up or down from these vehicles with telescopes and other instruments for unique observations. Various biological, life sciences, and physiological researchers have well-justified plans for studies from the small scale, like cellular signaling mechanisms, to the large, that is up to many dozens of human subjects. Our own atmosphere is so poorly studied in the mesosphere and lower thermosphere that little is known. It's even difficult to find an expert in this part of the atmosphere. Yet this region, which is above all the balloon flights and below all the orbits, is where these new rockets will fly and coast on every mission, thus enabling many novel studies of this region, which is already thought to be important to carbon transport in our atmosphere. All these and other fields of science can benefit from launching quickly, repeatedly, and affordably on the new vehicles. Already this industry is impacting education. I teach a zero-gravity flight experiment class at Purdue every semester, building experiments for launches with several of these companies and also now a payload for NASA Flight Opportunities Program launch. Other universities are beginning to be involved too. For high schools, an automated student payload is easily affordable and would be just the next step in high school robotics. Thus, we can couple right into a phenomenal and popular hands-on, project-based STEM education program that already exists nationwide in our high schools. I see every semester how Purdue students are pulled into the experiment program, become inspired by the reality of science and engineering, and make early career decisions or choices to pursue excellence in STEM topics. People, perhaps you, often ask me for one good reason why these new rockets will be important. Just one good reason. Let's try this one. These rockets will provide new research capabilities of value to numerous fields of science, and this will produce advances not otherwise possible. Why not a second good reason? These rockets will fly from numerous locations and on short notice, so transient and one-time events in astronomy, planetary science, Earth observation, and atmospheric research can be captured. I can continue. These rockets will fly a research payload for a small fraction of the cost of traditional sounding rockets. They will fly a research payload to space more gently than traditional rockets. Thus, more sensitive instruments can be flown, and also cheaper off-the-shelf instruments can be used. Some of these rockets will fly the experimenter with the experiment, which is really very common in most experimental sciences. These rockets will be reusable, thus driving down the cost. These rockets are developed with private financing, so research agencies pay only for the flights they need. The great accessibility of these rockets will enable a great number of spaceflight technologies to be tested and advanced inexpensively in space, accelerating NASA along its exploration mission and strengthening the American companies that produce spaceflight systems for NASA. These new rockets will enable a great mass of small robotic student experiments from all ages of students. High school space experiments? You bet. That's exactly what we're talking about with these rockets. Undergraduate and graduate students in engineering and sciences can design, build, and perform original space experiments within a school year. It's interesting to note that numerous science leaders today began their careers as graduate students in balloon and traditional sounding rocket experiments. So that's 10 good reasons, I see, for using these vehicles. They're good science reasons, they're good education reasons, and I think they're good value per dollar reasons too. We should use traditional rockets when their capabilities are required, but most research and education, or much research and education, will make tremendous gains on the new vehicles. I urge you, Senators, to help us jump into using this emerging United States industry broadly for science and STEM education. This does require some money, and it needs continuity and leadership. A multi-agency, multi-year program would be ideal. Now is the time to begin to create the impacts we desire from this industry. I thank you for your attention, and will do my best to answer questions for you.
Thank you all. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank each of the witnesses who testified today for your expertise and your illuminating comments. I want to begin by talking about the U.S. share of commercial launch right now. In 2012, as I understand it, there was roughly $2.4 billion in commercial launch revenues, and only about $108 million of that was attributed to the United States. And I'd like to ask each of the members of the panel why you believe that's the case, and what can be done to increase the U.S. share of that business.
Senator Cruz, I would offer for your consideration much of the difficulty in marketing U.S. launch systems abroad stems from the ITAR regulations, which restrict the use of U.S. technology for good reasons to prevent missile technology from falling into the hands of foreign states that could use it for bad purposes. But what we've seen is this caused other nations to develop their launch systems and in fact take away much of the business. I had opportunity to travel to India for NASA in my last year there, and we talked with the Indian Space Agency officials, and they thanked us very profusely for ITAR because that prodded them to build their own indigenous launch vehicles, and they use them to launch satellites today, and they're commercially available, and we see that around the world. So I am not an expert on how to solve this regulatory problem, but I would offer for your consideration that that is a major factor in making U.S. Satellite launches non-competitive worldwide.
Yes, Senator Cruz. Financing continues to be a barrier, a difficulty for companies who intend to do space launch rockets. It has been and continues to be a problem. I think what Mr. Hale just said with regard to ITAR is a big one, although we are seeing some improvements in the export control area. But other launching states have taken full advantage of that by advertising a place to do ITAR-free launches and satellites of satellites, which works to the disadvantage of the U.S. This has much to do with why I so strongly recommended the continuation of indemnification. At a minimum of 10 years on a permanent basis would be excellent. I think that it's important for all of us to recognize that indemnification is the one thing that the U.S. industry has as it enters into negotiations for launch with other competing launching states, that it can say its government stands behind it in risk-sharing mode. It's not an automatic provision, it's a recommendation to Congress for an emergency appropriation above what is required by the company to purchase in terms of insurance. And it's a protection for the government. So I think that it'll be really, really important for us to give as full consideration as possible to that, and that continue as a way of fostering the opportunity to increase market share.
Senator Cruz, I don't really have much substantive to add to the argument, but I mean, the observation is that this is a global marketplace, and to the extent that you can compete, you're going to be better at market share. And so the things that Mr. Hale and Ms. Smith have identified, which are ITAR regulation or ITAR reform, and extension of indemnification to provide a more level playing field for our providers vis-a-vis the foreign competitors, I think is key.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I don't work in that end of the business. I shouldn't speak as an expert here. I do speak to a lot of people and work with them in industry, and I would say that that exposure leads me to give you more confidence in what the other people have said.
Very good. And let me ask a follow-up question, in particular, Mr. Hale and Ms. Smith, which is, what do you all see as the most significant legal or regulatory obstacles to the continued expansion of commercial launch operations?
I would have to side with Ms. Smith that I think one of the greatest things that would be of benefit to this commercial enterprise is continued indemnification. The high costs of insurance and, frankly, the uncertainties in the American legal system are of great concern to investors. And as we look forward to private industry providing lower cost launch systems that will be competitive in the world market, we must find a way to ensure that they are reasonably protected in these areas.
Let me speak first to the question from the suborbital sector side. We have an oddity of sorts in the FAA, that we have a line of business that has statutory authority to license and regulate and promote the U.S. commercial launch industry, responsible as a one-stop shop to do that licensing, regulating, and promoting. We have hybrid launch vehicles that have aviation elements as well as space elements. And the question is, as often arises in a regulatory agency where you have differing industries, who has responsibility when it's operating as anything other than an express launch vehicle. I think that that is an issue that only Congress can resolve legislatively by amending the act to make it clear that the reasoning, the motivation behind allocating that responsibility to the Office of Commercial Space Transportation still holds. It's very important to those launch operators in that it causes increased costs when they have to travel between two regulatory authorities. It could also cause inconsistencies when it comes to safety. So extremely important in order to further that industry and not delay its business plans and its launch plans going forward to become a full-fledged industry sector. I think that to the extent that as commercial space has evolved over time, it's a cyclical industry. It has had several fits and starts, but it has continued with the passion and the intent to move forward to become one day a full-fledged line of transportation, form of transportation. So I think to the extent that things like indemnification, things like resolving any regulatory tangles, continuing the opportunity through the flexibility that is allowed in the statute for these vehicle operators to test and develop, do more testing and development, collect sufficient data to move forward is extremely important. And one that I would encourage that approach.
Very good. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cruz, and I certainly agree with you all on the indemnification. I had to get down on my knees and beg to finally get indemnification extended for just 1 year, and this is no way to run a railroad. Businesses can't plan on this. So we need a multi-year, and I agree with you, Ms. Smith, that we need to have a much longer. Now, on ITAR, basically we got a political problem. And you need to do business in an ideal world, as you all say, in the international arena, but those who would do ill to the ideals and the policies of this country, you've just got to be realist about it. So as we plan our commercial space ventures, that's the reality of the world. I hope we can solve the insurance problem of indemnification for multi-year and do that in this upcoming NASA authorization bill. On saying that we're going to do business with somebody who's doing business with one of the political enemies of the United States is going to be a much harder task. Captain, you're so right on in pointing out the huge difference between Mach 3 and Mach 25. But right now, as you pointed out, the space tourism market is with regard to Mach 3, to get up to suborbit, have a few minutes of weightlessness, and then come right back. What kind of revenues do you see being generated from this space tourism kind of experience over the next few years?
Thanks, Chairman, for the question. I should refer you to a study that was done by the Tory Group that was released last year, commissioned by the FAA and by Space Florida. I think it came out last summer. And if memory serves, they, with some very, I would say, conservative assumptions, predicted that the market over the next decade would be about $600 million. But that was, again, a pretty suppressed view. They had a growth scenario where the revenue was much, much higher than that. Now, that's for the entire suborbital industry, of which they determined that 80% or so was driven by tourism, about 10% by research, and the remaining 10% was divided into 6 different other smaller markets.
And so right now, the cost for a tourist to go in one of these up to the edge of space where they can see the curvature, a couple of minutes of 0G and then return, the cost is what? A few $100,000 per seat?
I think the lowest price that I've seen is a little less than $100,000, and the high end is around $200,000.
And so realistically, over time, will that cost come down per seat?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the providers are counting on that, and this technology that I mentioned that XCOR demonstrated will make their vehicle be a lot like an airplane, where you land it, the fuel is non-toxic, it's basically jet fuel. You put the hose on the airplane, you gas it up, and you go again. So they could fly several times a day, and clearly the more times you fly, the more you amortize your fixed cost, and the cost per seat will come down.
So then it's realistic to expect that it's going to get to the point where universities could buy a seat to send Dr. Collicott's students.
I would point out that, in fact, they already have. Universities and other research groups have purchased some seats, and I would expect that only to increase as the price comes down, as you say.
That's pretty exciting, isn't it, Dr. Collicott, that you might send your class to space, to the edge of space, go Mach 3, couple minutes of 0G, and then come back.
Yes, it is, Chairman. We have it's no secret, Purdue has a down payment on a spot on a Virgin Galactic science flight. I'm not going to fly. We are anticipating 200 pounds of automated payload to advance high-tech Indiana industry. Certainly when word got out, a large number of graduate students came to my office interested in the opportunity, and even had good discussions with risk management at Purdue about the feasibility, and seemed to me to them it was just an old or a new technology to an old question. You know, we need to go do research, we need to go do activities, whether it's researchers in Antarctica or wherever. And so to me it was really reassuring that it's not entirely new news. And I do look forward to the day a potential PhD student walks into my office and says, well, Professor, I flew in space for my master's degree. What do you have to offer?
Well, maybe at that point we've got orbital hotels or laboratories that would enable a student to go into orbit by going Mach 25. But tell me, Ms. Smith, do you think that FAA and NASA working together can handle all the regulation of this exploding potential new business of space tourism?
That's a good question, Senator and Mr. Chairman. I would say that absolutely yes. Making the distinction that the FAA is a regulatory agency, NASA is not, but certainly NASA's experience in human spaceflight is tremendous. I don't think that the amount of experience, the lessons learned, the differing types of experience that NASA has exist in any place else the way that it does in NASA. So FAA right now, Commercial Space Transportation Office, has had the majority of experience in dealing with commercial operators. That's its business, and that's what it has been doing. Partnering with NASA going forward to launch members of the public to suborbital space and ultimately to space one day, orbital space. I think it is a natural kind of partnership that exists and will link itself together very, very closely as we go forward to actually have operational flights that take people to and from suborbit. So yes, I do think so.
By the way, one of you mentioned that the life of the International Space Station ought to be extended to its expected design life in the late 20s. And I certainly agree. You remember when this thing started out, we had just gotten it built and just gotten it put together, and it was going to cease to exist after 2016. We got that extended to 2020, and I'm hoping that as the station starts to show its value, particularly with some of these promising new drugs that are being developed in their initial research stages, something that the average person on the street can identify with as to the value of what's happening on board the space station, that I'm hoping that incentives like that will enable us then to go ahead in the authorization to get it extended in its life. I want to ask Dr. Collicott, getting back to suborbital space, to what degree has your suborbital research opportunities encouraged your students to pursue careers in aerospace?
Thank you, Chairman. Certainly, they choose to come to our Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics because that's already in their mind. So what I think I see is just when they get involved in these long-term, team-based, multidisciplinary, hands-on original projects, I think they start to see how much good work they can do, and their interactions with the companies and be it FAA or spaceports or whomever really helps open their eyes to the industry, the reality of the industry they're heading into. And I think it gives them great encouragement that the great achievements in aerospace are within their reach. They can be part of the teams that achieve these great things. So I see it as a great strengthening of their perhaps a childhood dream or childhood hope to get into aerospace.
Do your students come to you thinking that the space program is over because of the mental image of the shutdown of the space shuttle?
I'm very fortunate in my job at Purdue that many of our students, most of our students, come in pretty well informed and are aware that NASA's still in business. We still fly Americans in space. Space station is still operational. It's really more the thoughts you mentioned. I really see more as I'm going around town and around the country talking to general public.
Well, that is a fact. And what we're going to see is as the Mars program starts to kick in, and we'll start to see the first evidence of that next year as the Orion capsule is flight tested, then that awareness of the human space program will return. Then, of course, with whenever we can get Americans flying on American vehicles up to the space station, combine that with what's happening on the surface of Mars right now, and I think you're going to begin to get a gradual re-recognition of America's role in space. Senator Cruz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address a question primarily to Mr. Smith and Mr. Hale, but would welcome the comments from any members of the panel. As you know, the FAA is currently under a moratorium on issuing regulations regarding certain aspects of commercial space flight. And what I would like to ask you is if you can elaborate on your views as to the importance of that moratorium and whether it should be extended and in what regards.
Mm-hmm. Since I was at the FAA when the 2004 Act was first passed, and we had a very, very clear sense then, and I think now, that even while the moratorium was in place, if we had an unfortunate circumstance, if we observed something that was not safe, then we would be obligated to step up our oversight, to begin regulating, to recommend to Congress that we take a different approach if that were to happen. In the interim, I think the reason for the moratorium was to allow the time for vehicle developers to test and develop, to continue to collect data, to try things, to see if they work, all operating under the broad rubric of safety, which is the mantra in the commercial space launch industry. I think that things have not materialized as quickly as perhaps Congress contemplated at the time, and we have yet to have those first flights, operational flights, taking people to and from suborbital space that would allow the collection of data. However, every one of the vehicle developers that are in this market are testing, collecting data all the time, testing and developing, and they continue to maintain a position that says that they will fly when they're ready to fly, not before. So I think to the extent that the moratorium would be extended, I would say 8 years beyond the first operational flight with humans on it.
Senator Cruz, I'm mindful of the fact that the FAA does in fact provide regulations for suborbital flight today, but they're regulations to protect the public. So the FAA has an extensive licensing process to ensure that these suborbital operators are protecting the non-involved public and property, and that is a very important aspect of their work. The other aspect of this is that everyone recognizes that in these early days, this is an experimental, high-risk situation, and the spaceflight participants, the space tourists, if you will, that are going to participate in this, need to be fully informed of the risks that are involved when they take on this high-risk endeavor. People in America today can take on many high-risk endeavors. Backcountry skiing, scuba diving in certain places. There are all kinds of high-risk endeavors that the federal government does not regulate, but to which we try to make sure the participants are fully informed of the hazards. And that, I think, is the basis for the current moratorium, that these participants coming from fields not versed in the necessarily aerospace can be informed of what it is they're really signing up for and have informed consent. That's a very important part of this so-called moratorium. And the other part of it, I think, also is that the Federal Aviation Administration is struggling with exactly how to write regulations for this new industry, and that some experience in watching how the industry performs would be very helpful to the FAA as they consider what regulations might be required. To go out and write regulations in advance of operations, I think, would be a very onerous thing to the industry and probably not efficient from the government standpoint.
Thank you. Now I'd like to ask a question of Captain Lopez-Alegria, which is, many of the concerns we hear about commercial space have to do with the prospects of actual markets that will be able to sustain these efforts over and above the provision of services to the government. And can you share your views regarding the potential markets outside of the U.S. government?
Yes. May I just add on to what the...
Absolutely, please.
So first of all, I would agree with both Wayne and Patti about what they said. First of all, the FAA is certainly regulating third-party safety right now. And also the reason that this learning period was put into place was to allow industry to innovate, so we wouldn't stifle things to cut off solutions to technical problems before their time. But just from a philosophical standpoint, while I think 8 years is a good number, which is a number that they picked in 2004, I wonder whether this industry needs to have that learning period removed ever. And I know that sounds a little drastic, but let me just walk you through that. So you know, as Wayne mentioned, scuba diving, bungee jumping, there are a lot of things that people do that most others would consider high risk. And I would be happy to see regulation in the commercial spaceflight industry when the commercial spaceflight industry looks like the commercial aviation industry. When it's that routine, when you can get on an airplane just like it's a taxi or any other mode of transportation, I think regulation is appropriate then. That to me seems like a long way off, and so I would just put out there as a stake in the ground that this is something that as long as people can operate under informed consent and be well informed of those risks, that we ought to let that work in that sort of more free and enterprising environment. So on the question of orbital markets.
And can you elaborate for a bit more on the deleterious impact that you think it would have if the moratorium were to expire on a sooner time frame?
I think there are two things. First, while the industry is still in development, the degree to which companies can choose to use a hybrid rocket motor or a liquid rocket motor or some other kind of rocket motor, they ought to be able to choose that and not have the FAA or anybody else say, you need to use a liquid rocket motor because that's what NASA's been using on their vehicles or something like that. So one is the reduction of the set of options available to solve technical problems. And the second is that when in the absence of regulation, people can exercise their own judgment to inform themselves of what the risks are. And I do want to mention that Mr. Hale is chairing our committee within the commercial spaceflight industry of developing standards, and one of the standards is to define exactly what that piece of paper should say that the customer spaceflight participant would have to read before he gets on the rocket and signs his informed consent. But to the extent that we have industries that have commerce based on people that are willing to do those things as long as they're informed, and that the government protect people who are not second parties to that, then I think it is more in keeping with our sort of philosophy of free and open markets.
Okay, and if you had some comments on the additional.
Right, so back to the orbit. I wish I could point to a study like the Torrey Group study on the suborbital side, and I can't. I will just make the following observation. I flew in 2006 with a so-called spaceflight participant, a tourist that went up to the ISS on a Soyuz seat, and I flew home in 2007 with another one that had flown up in the meantime. And every single excess Soyuz seat has been sold with unsatisfied demand. So clearly there is a market out there. Now, are there as many people that can pay that kind of price as there can that can pay the suborbital price? Clearly not. But the idea is that once you start filling excess capacity with non-government or at least non-U.S. government, so they could be sovereign government clients, or they could be private research firms, or they could be universities, or they could be just private citizens that could either take 3 of the 7 seats that are on all of these commercial crew vehicles to the ISS, use the national lab facilities that are up there that are dedicated to private and academic research to come up with some aha moment, decide, hey, I'd like to be able to do this on a bigger scale, go contract with Bigelow, get an inflatable habitat, have your own transportation. That's how the market's going to start. I just can't say when.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that was my question, when?
It's hard to, I think even the folks that did the suborbital market would say it's hard to predict markets that don't exist yet. But all I can say, like the famous movie quote, is I think the answer is build it and they will come.
Senator Nelson, if I could just add on to that, it is imperative that we provide low-cost or have the capability to have low-cost transportation to low Earth orbit, we see a plethora of business opportunities that are proposed and discussed in serious matters in space, and they're all currently coming up against this cost of transportation to low Earth orbit. And if, in fact, we build this industry that provides much lower cost to low Earth orbit, there are huge numbers of businesses out there that would like to take advantage of it. And I think that it's very difficult to put that in an academic study and qualify that in the ways that the folks like to see these things footnoted. But it just from the amount of literature and the number of people that are proposing businesses in space, there is a huge demand for transportation. The question is, how low can we make the cost for reliable and safe transportation? And I think American private enterprise that's their mission, is to develop low-cost capabilities that make money.
In your opening comments, you talked about how you could blend commercial space opportunities with NASA's plans for deep space exploration. And you stated you could get components and fuel and so forth up cheaper through the commercial space ventures, and that would supply then the NASA deep space ventures. You want to expand on that, or anyone on the panel want to expand on that cooperation?
Thank you for that question, Senator Nelson. I think it's very important to consider this opportunity. And the first part of my statement of commercial space supporting the deep space exploration initiatives that NASA has in their future is with the International Space Station. I mean, there are many people today that are anxious to go on long-duration deep space missions, and that is clearly the future of where NASA is going to go, because the government's role truly is to push back the frontier, where probably the return on investment is a longer term than the business spreadsheets like for it to be. Those long-duration missions require a different kind of technology than we have previously seen, but they're being tested and tried out today on the International Space Station. It doesn't sound very glamorous, but every time I read in the space station report that the urine processor assembly is broken down and the crew's got to go fix it, that's another step on the learning curve to building a good closed-loop environmental control system that you're going to need to go on a month-long mission to an asteroid or a 3-year-long mission to Mars. Those kinds of technologies, even though we try to test them on the ground, they really aren't proven until they've flown in space and you get to see what an actual operation in space does to those engineering systems. That's vitally important. So keeping the International Space Station going as a test bed, supplying it with cargo and crews, vitally important, and that is exactly what the cargo resupply services contract is all about. That's exactly what the Commercial Crew Program Office is trying to provide. Having said that, there are many ways to explore deep space. The current plan that NASA is developing with the Space Launch System and the multipurpose crew vehicle, the Orion capsule, I think are aimed toward those deep space opportunities. But every mission study that I have seen to go to the moon, to Mars, requires a huge amount of logistics. If you want to go back to do anything other than flags and footprints, you need logistics. I think it was General Schwarzkopf that said that armchair generals study tactics and real generals study logistics. Getting mass to low Earth orbit is halfway to anywhere in the universe. And if we can supply equipment, fuel, even crews cheaply to low Earth orbit, that has got to be a vital link in ensuring that whatever deep space capabilities we go from low Earth orbit in pursuit of, we have the material that we need to make them successful. So low-cost transportation enables all of that. That's what we're all about in the commercial space enterprises.
I agree with you. Why do you think it's been so hard to change the mentality in our American space program to get to that point that eventually, I think you say, that's what will happen. The commercial program will collaborate, supplement, enhance the NASA deep space program. Why has it been so hard to get there?
People in my generation grew up with Apollo, Senator, and that is our mental model for how space exploration should be done. And the situation and the world geopolitics in the 1960s, that was the only way to carry out such a model. That could work today, but it would require a huge expenditure of taxpayer money. I'm sure that given 4 or 5% of the federal budget, NASA could completely do that job. But knowing that the United States consensus on how much of their national treasure we are willing to devote to space exploration is about 0.5% of the federal budget. That's the consensus. That's where it's been for more than 2 decades. We need to see how we can leverage that to do those great things, and it can't all be done by NASA. It's going to take commercial advocacy, commercial efforts. You know, most of the immigrants that came to the United States did not come, some of them did, but for political or religious reasons, but most people came here to make money for economic reasons. And having an economic reason to go into space will become a self-igniting source of future development and transportation. The United States government buys airline tickets to fly people around, doesn't operate their own airline by and large, so on and so forth. That's the way space exploration, space travel needs to evolve as well.
Anybody else want to comment on that? The question is, why has it been so hard for the American space program to change, to accept the fact that the commercial space program can be complementary to the deep space exploration?
I think that for many, many years since the Commercial Space Launch Act of 1984, space was seen by many people who were not as passionate as we all are, as space enthusiasts and committed people to the evolution of this industry. Many people simply did not think that it would happen. They saw it in the domain of the government exclusively and did not understand the role of private enterprise in fostering the goals of space. I think from that point, it goes to where we sit is what we know often. So NASA, as the vanguard of space for the country, the agency principally responsible for space exploration, continued to feel that and enjoy a reputation, as it does now, as the premier agency for space. I can tell you that even though the FAA was solely responsible for commercial space transportation, anytime a rocket launched, people associated it with NASA. That has changed over time. That is changing every day. And I think that the kind of partnership that NASA has helped foster with the commercial industry through Space Act agreements, its COTS program, CCIPT program, those things will continue to represent to the American public what is possible through commercial space transportation as the government helps enable that. So I think that is a part of the reason. I think another part of the reason is that people just simply hadn't seen it. Something changed in the landscape in 2004 with the launch of Spaceship One. Standing there at the flight line, looking at people who had traveled there from all over the country and the world to see that, to witness that, to be a part of that, as many of them had when the first shuttle launch took place, was an astounding thing to see. And people then saw that as a real possibility, that we can do this commercially, that we can contribute to the nation's space story in a viable way. So I think as we go forward and as space becomes more, commercial space becomes more a reality in NASA, meeting NASA requirements going forward, meeting NASA requirements in terms of crew and cargo to the ISS, spawning other destinations in space, inflatables like Bigelow Aerospace, I think that that gap, that reason for not moving as quickly as we could have will change.
Anybody else? Well, of course, one of the questions that Senator Cruz and I have to deal with as we get ready for this NASA authorization bill is the continued amount of money that will go into the commercial crew program. And of course, I think the atmosphere is getting better because of the successes that we've seen, but the successes that we've seen with regard to the commercial rockets and the commercial cargo, but in the past it sure has been difficult to get people to recognize what a lot of you all are talking about. Any closing comments from any of you all? Well, it's been most illuminating. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
It now enters a new dimension of commercial space. I just came from a meeting with the President's nominee for the Department of Transportation, and we discussed the same. And it's very important that the Office of Commercial Space Transportation in the Department of Transportation understand that they should never get into these stovepipes that are so typical in government, where turf becomes more important than the mission. And then the turf battles and all the little jealousies occur. And that the Department of Transportation, I shared with the nominee, should do what their mission is, which is to handle and administratively and let NASA do what NASA does best and not try to compete with each other. Now, we're going to be doing a NASA authorization bill this year, and it's going to be an updating of the Commercial Space Launch Act. And so we're going to be using these hearings to help us develop the policy that will continue to guide our space community toward the goal of exploring the heavens. And so there's a lot to discuss, suborbital space, and I'm going to insert in the record my comments. Let me introduce our panel members. Wayne Hale comes to us as Director of the Human Spaceflight for Special Aerospace Services. He's retired NASA. He's held positions including NASA Flight Director and Space Shuttle Program Manager. Mr. Hale is going to discuss how commercial space efforts contribute toward national space exploration goals and the government's role in supporting the private space sector growth. Ms. Patti Grace Smith is an aerospace consultant and advisor. She has extensive experience in the U.S. space sector, both as a former associate administrator of FAA.
Creative drive of the private sector. Our economy has a great stake in the space race. Last year, 78 orbital launches were conducted worldwide, 20 of which were commercial launches. And those 20 launches generated more than $2.4 billion in revenues. of which an estimated $108 million was attributed to U.S. launches. Activity in the space industry creates good high-tech jobs now, and it inspires our next generation of leaders as well. For years, the U.S. government has worked as a partner with the commercial space industry, and the NASA Authorization Act of 2010 set in place a productive balance between the two that continues to bear fruit. Today, I look forward to hearing from our panel about how we can achieve even greater efficiencies from that balance and how we can encourage more significant investment from the commercial space industry and what legal and regulatory challenges are presented by its future development. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. As you can see, we run things a little differently on this committee. We're a little more informal. But when it gets to the subject of commercial space, it becomes extremely important. It becomes extremely important that we get American vehicles flying Americans back up to the space station. It's extremely important that we have vehicles that are designed the safest possible, which the new generation of rockets are being designed that way. It was certainly an admonition of the Gaiman Commission that investigated the last space shuttle disaster that said that once you've completed the space station with the space shuttle, you shut it down and you replace it with a safer rocket. And of course, that is being designed right now. We see the new applications of commercial activity in space. And although we've always had, basically, it's been the contractors that have produced the hardware and the systems under NASA's direction that has given us this extraordinarily successful program. As an accommodation to the senator from Indiana who wants to make a special introduction, Senator Cruz and I will turn to him first.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Cruz, I thank you for the privilege of doing this. As you know, I tried hard to get on this subcommittee and didn't make it on the basis of seniority, but I commend both you and Senator Cruz for your leadership on this. It's real pleasure for me to introduce a distinguished constituent from Purdue University, Stephen Collicott. Dr. Stephen Collicott is an expert in his field and has received his undergraduate degrees from the University of Michigan and master's from Stanford, but joined the Purdue faculty in West Lafayette, Indiana, in 1991, where he is a professor in the School of Aeronautics and Astronautics. As you know, Mr. Chairman, our Aero-Astro program at Purdue is fairly well known. 22 astronauts have come out of Purdue and flown. Maybe one of them with you on your flight. I'm not so sure about that.
Do you know the institution that has produced more than any other university?
I'd love to say it was Purdue, but I think you're going to probably name some university in Florida.
No, it's actually the Naval Academy.
Oh, really? Okay. That makes sense. The ultimate in flying assignments. But such notables as Gus Grissom and Neil Armstrong and many, many others have come out of the Purdue program. Dr. Collicott has led a team of students in providing a experimental project that will be operated on the International Space Station and a number of other distinguished accomplishments. And so I want to just welcome him here today. I regret that I don't serve on this subcommittee. I would love to stay, but other subcommittees have made other callings, so I have to excuse myself on that. But I thank you for the opportunity to introduce Dr. Collicott.
Thank you so much. Senator Cruz?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses who are here today. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity for us to have this hearing and to get to know more about the exciting potential for advancing our space-related knowledge and achievement by taking advantage of the competitive forces and
Office of Commercial Space, and as the current chair of the NASA Advisory Council's Commercial Space Committee. She will address the federal policies, needs, and recommendations affecting the private space industry and ways to maximize collaborations between FAA, NASA, and private space ventures. Captain Michael Lopez-Alegria is president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. A NASA astronaut, a veteran of 4 space flights, commander of ISS Expedition 14. Now he works to promote commercial spaceflight. And he'll provide an overview of the progress and plans of the commercial spaceflight industry, as well as policy recommendations. And Dr. Collicott, we have already had introduced by the senator from Indiana. So thank you for being here and bringing your expertise to the discussion. So with that, Mr. Hale, we're going to put your written testimony in the record. If you'll summarize it within about 5 minutes, and we'll just go down the line. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Chairman Senator Nelson, and thank you, Ranking Member Senator Cruz, and the entire committee for inviting me to testify on this important matter. In the interest of full disclosure, you should note that I spent most of my professional life working at NASA in the Space Shuttle program. As a matter of fact, Senator Nelson, I was in mission control during your flight just a few years ago. During those many years, I have seen NASA at its very best and at its worst. The hard-working dedication of NASA personnel is phenomenal, and their talent and creativity are second to none. However, their endeavors have frequently been stymied due to the inherent bureaucratic inefficiencies of government work and the frequent shifts in priorities and funding that whipsaw space initiatives. My last NASA assignment was to define the management philosophy for the new Commercial Crew Program. After leaving NASA, my work has continued as a consultant. My company, Special Aerospace Services, advises entities involved in the commercial crew and commercial space cargo enterprises. And I have volunteered my time to work with the Commercial Spaceflight Federation to establish industry standards for this fledgling community. So the committee can see that I am hardly a disinterested party. In space today, the most singularly vexing problem is the high cost of getting to low Earth orbit. As Robert Hale once observed, when you are in Earth orbit, you are halfway to anywhere in the universe, which accurately reflects the physics of the situation. Today, getting that first step to the universe is very costly. Hundreds of potential business opportunities in the limitless resources of the solar system have floundered on the high cost of transportation to low Earth orbit. Asteroid mining, energy production, zero-gravity manufacturing are all within our grasp technologically, but will not be profitable businesses, until reliable and reasonably affordable transportation systems are in place. However, these new transportation systems to low Earth orbit have very high development cost. So we are in a chicken or the egg paradox. Space business needs low-cost transportation to become profitable, while potential private transportation services need established businesses to justify the cost of their construction. This is not the first time America has been in this situation. Both the early railroads and the fledgling air transportation industries found themselves becalmed in similar straits. The federal taxpayer stepped in to provide critical resources to help those industries develop. These federal investments paid back myriad-fold in tax revenues when the new industries caught fire. The history of space flight has been marked with the goal of decreasing the cost of transportation to low Earth orbit. In the last decade, the United States has embarked on a bold new experiment to turn over the creative reins of spacecraft development to nimble, flexible, creative, private commercial firms. Bolstered with a modicum of taxpayer resources, these businesses have leveraged private investment to develop new, much cheaper transportation systems. We see the first fruits of success today with the cargo-carrying craft, SpaceX's Falcon and Dragon, and Orbital Sciences' Antares and Cygnus. These cargo-carrying privately developed vehicles are starting to supply our government outpost, the International Space Station. In future years, the Boeing CST-100 and Sierra Nevada Dream Chaser, both flying on the proven ULA Atlas V rocket, will be added to the fleet to carry human beings as well as cargo. Poised on the cusp of these new systems, America runs the risk of being penny-wise and pound-foolish as we make the same mistake that doomed the space shuttle to much higher-cost operations, starving spacecraft development programs in the name of saving a few pennies for today's budget bottom line, resulting in compromised systems that, if they fly at all, will not be cheap enough to enable business